So, good morning, everybody. So we're here today on, I think, the September 2nd, as my slide says. So today we're going to be discussing invoicing for the CRF funds. So the department has put together a presentation that I think Barbara and I are probably going to lead the discussion on. So as always, if you have any questions, feel free to put those into the chat box, or you can raise your hand. We have a number of people who are kind of looking out for if people have questions or have any comments and or would like to speak. And then, so, until you actually, until you need to speak, go ahead and leave yourself muted just to limit the background noise. So I'm going to go ahead and share the slides. I think, hopefully. Okay. So for today's office hours for the business managers, and so I guess I can start this off and just, so the CRF, the purpose of these funds, the Governor Mills and Maine Department of Education announced a commitment of $165 million in CRF funds, which is an urgently needed investment to cover unanticipated costs associated with the safe opening and operation of schools during COVID-19 pandemic. So funding will be made to SAUs, charter schools, town academies, CTE regents, magnet schools, and adult ed. Allocations are based on a per pupil formula and weighted equity. So under the CRF funds, currently we have the, I guess I'm going to go with the big allocation that Rui and Stan have been leading up that effort as of late. So, or I should say Stan since the beginning, and Rui as of late to help out with the invoicing and some of the other, just processing of those funds. We also have the CRF Adult Education Funds, and so those allocations are being handled by the Adult Ed team. And then the CRF Day Programming, those funds are being managed by, so I'm going to say Leanne Larson, but she also has some other people that are assisting her. I believe it's Nicole Medor, maybe assisting in some capacity, and Marcy Whitcomb. So all of those funds can be found at the CARES Act webpage. So today we're going to talk about the CRF fund versus the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds, the timeline, the allowable costs, the reimbursement process. So that would include the invoice, the backup documentation, and time and effort certification, fiscal compliance, and closing remarks.
All right. You want me to take it from here, Tyler?
Yeah. Why don't you go?
I'm on my way. Here I come. So the first thing we wanted to do is put up a slide sort of outlining the difference between your CRF funds and your ESSER funds, because in some respects, they're very much the same thing. But I think there are a few really key differences that you need to note. And first and foremost is the availability of the funds. You'll note that the CRF funds are short-term emergency funds to comply with the health and safety guidelines to open and operate schools safely, whereas the ESSER funds are more to address specific challenges that have been presented by COVID and increase in costs. So those are the two really primary differences. So you'll note that the CRF funds can be spent through 12/30 of the end of 2020, very short term, whereas the ESSER funds are 2-year funds. The application deadline for the CRF funds is September 30th. Whereas the application for the ESSER funds is more of a rolling application deadline. No hard deadline has been established. I will say that, well, we'll talk about that later on. So again, the difference between your CRF and your ESSER funds is your CRF funds are urgent funds to comply with the health and safety guidelines to safely open and operate schools for the school year 2021. Whereas the ESSER funds cover an extensive cadre of expenses that were all presented to you because of COVID. So these are ongoing expenses. And like I said, they're good for 2 years. So your CRF funds cannot be something that has been previously planned or was inclusive in your budget before you receive CRF funds. This has to be emergency, urgently needed fundings to open schools for the FY21 year safely. Whereas the ESSER funds there absolutely is no supplement, not supplant provision in the ESSER funds whatsoever. So the latitude of your ESSER funds is much greater than your CRF funds. You can use this to help with loss of revenue, whereas CRF funds you cannot. Both require time and effort. So anytime you spend $1 federal funds on salaries and benefits, you're required to maintain time and effort. Next slide. Unless did we have questions on that one? Okay. Well, let's go over the timeline for your CRF.
Tyler, I do have a statement. This is Stan. On that slide, it says the deadline is September 30th for applications. I just want to clarify that, if I may. The initial budget application was due August 31st. Only if individuals feel they want to change their budget allocation do they need to reapply for a final application and a final budget, which is due September 30th. That August 31st deadline has passed. However, I am still working with about 18 school systems that we've allowed to exceed that budget deadline because there is more information they needed to provide in order for me to accept their application. And Chelsea and her team are also notifying, I believe, today around 21 potential applicants who have not applied initially. And a lot of those are private schools, etc. And we just want to make sure that they're not interested in that, those funds are applying. So even though the deadline is passed, there are a few outstanding ones that we're still going to honor after the August 31st deadline. But I did want to clarify that that September 30th deadline is only for those districts that want to substantially change their initial budget. And so they're applying for revisions, and that is due September 30th. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stan. We'll outline that here in the timeline as well. So you'll see on July 17th, DOE released the CRF #1 allocations, and then followed that up on July 24th with the application. On August 5th and 12th, DOE provided training and support to all SAU leaders. On the 31st, as Stan just said, all initial applications were due to come in to Stan at DOE. And then on September 4th, all CRF Day programming initial applications were due. And I believe those went to Leanne Larson. And then September 30th, as Stan just kind of highlighted for us, all CRF #1 final budgets, which reflected any changes that you wanted to make to that initial request, are due to DOE. And we did want to point out that this September 30 deadline is a hard deadline, so their extensions are not permissible under CRF. So if you haven't got that application in, and as Stan just said, they're still willing to accept them, you want to make sure that you get those in just as quick as you can. Obviously, if it was up to DOE, we would be flexible, but on some things we can't be flexible. So this is one of them. So make sure that if you have an application that needs revision in any way, shape, or form, that you get that done by September 30th. And I think I would target a couple days before then. So on October 2nd, the first performance report will be due from you to DOE, and reporting guidance and templates will be made available prior to October 2nd. And I'm sure, Tyler, you'll probably have another training, and Stan and Rui, on what that looks like. December 30th is your deadline. It says liquidate. It should say to spend. So you have, there's a little typo in here. So you have until December 30th to incur your expenses. So order supplies, order equipment, pay employees, and then you have, and we'll go over this in a slide down the road here. You have until January 29th to liquidate. So that means getting your invoices into DOE for payment. But you have until December 30th to spend your funds. And then January 2nd will be your final report, will be due to DOE. And again, that reporting guidance and templates will be forthcoming. So I did want to put a note at the bottom here that failure to meet reporting deadlines will impact your ability to seek reimbursement and could result in the repayment of federal funds. So I want to just be really, really make it just such a point that these are hard deadlines that we're not able to manipulate. So just good information for you to have moving forward. Next slide.
Well, so okay.
Barbara, I'd like to pause for some questions that are very specific to the timeline. First one, Tyler, I'm going to send to you. Recognizing January 2nd is a weekend, and that obviously the department was given these dates, what is the date, if I'm taking a holiday break, that I would need to submit my reporting?
So so if January 2nd falls on a Saturday, so the first would be the holiday itself, which would be the Friday. So it's either going to be the 4th. I would presume it's going to be the 4th, but I guess we'll have to go back to Shirley for clarification.
Okay, the second question, we will need to go back because the dates have come directly to the department from DAFs, so we can follow up with them. But I suspect it will be, they'll expect you to send them earlier, not later, because DAFs will need everything on the 4th so that they can send it to the US Treasury. So just for now, I would pencil in my calendar December 30th. Barb, you've been on the reporting conversations. Anything you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, I believe it probably will be earlier rather than after. Simply because, Chelsea, like you said, DAFs needs time on their end to prepare everything to go in to the feds. So I would plan earlier rather than later, just to err on the side of caution.
The next question is related to the obligation dates. So as you both know, the dates that the department put out earlier differed a bit. Barb, what has happened since the last FAQs were released and today, given the October date seems to have shifted?
So I'm not sure I understood the question. Chelsea, can you say that again?
Yeah, so on the FAQs, it says you have until October 15th to submit your initial report. Now that date has changed to October 2nd. Mm-hmm. Why the change?
Well, I'm going to have to throw that over to Stan since I'm kind of a guest speaker here on the reimbursement process. I'm not and haven't been following CRF funds like Stan has. Chelsea?
So I know my role is to ask questions, but I'm going to answer this one because I have the answer.
Good.
The answer, so the deadline for obligation and submitting the original report, details have come forward from the U.S. Treasury and DAFS, the state's business office, in the past week. And so that date has changed from October 15th to October 2 because the department has been told our reporting is due sooner. So that is a significant change, which is why we're doing this training and also updating the FAQs and releasing them again today. We know how frustrating it is that things have shifted. Every time, though, we are informed that the federal U.S. Treasury has made a change and we find out, we are informing you right away. So that is a firm deadline. It has changed. It is not October 15th. It will be October 2nd. And we will do a training next Wednesday at this time to go over the reporting requirements as we have them now.
Thank you, Chelsea. That's great information. I'm sure
I'm going to
more than one person probably noticed the loss of 13 days there. So I know I would have. But I mean, all of these emergency funds are just that. They're emergency funds. They're coming fast and they're being handled by DOE to the best of our ability to make sure that you all are going to be covered when it comes to any kind of audits. So just know that DOE is working very hard to, and some of the requirements of you are to ensure that you're fine moving into the future with these funds in the event of an audit.
Thank you, Barb. The next question is going to Tyler. Tyler, if we are leasing storage areas for the year, will it be permissible to pay for that storage in December, but maintain the storage until June? In other words, can we pay 6 months in advance?
So no, you cannot prepay expenses for after the December 30th deadline.
Okay. The next question, I'm going to send it now back to you, Tyler. What will the performance report on October 2 include? Does that mean that we have to have everything obligated by then and we can't have any new expenses after that?
So that's the October 2nd report?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So with that one, again, I know my role is to ask questions and not to give answers, but because Barb and I were just in a session with DAFS on this, if you don't mind, Tyler,
Yep.
I'm happy to help. Okay. So the report that will be on October 2nd, we will go over it more in depth Wednesday at 10 a.m. But we have been told you will need to report out on 18 categories, both your obligation and your expenditures. So we'll have that template next Wednesday and we'll go over it in detail with you so that you'll be successful.
But you would still be able to obligate funds through December 30th.
Absolutely. Now the next one, there's a question about the adult education deadline. Will the October 2 submission of the reports not apply? The October 2 deadline, that does not come from the Department of Education. It's coming from the U.S. Treasury down to the state's DAFS team. So we cannot move those deadlines. They are firm deadlines, and they will apply to any CRF program that had made an allocation prior to then. So all of them do apply to this deadline, and we will go into reporting more in depth next Wednesday. I really want to keep us focused on reimbursement today because I know many of you have your approvals again in hand and are trying to get those invoices approved. I'm going to let you keep going, Barb and Tyler, and I'm going to keep collecting questions, and where it's the appropriate space, we'll ask them.
Sounds good. Next slide, Tyler.
Yep.
Allowable costs. So under CRF, you cannot seek reimbursement for anything that had previously been planned or entered into your budget. So these are emergency funds, not funds to pay for things that had currently or previously been budgeted for. So the cost can't have been accounted for in the most recently approved budget if the cost is for a substantially different use. We're gonna talk about the definition of substantially different use in a slide, an upcoming slide. So we're gonna pass over that for now. Expenses by CRF must address allowable urgent needs caused by COVID. They must not be reimbursed through any other funding source. They must be incurred between March 1st and December 30th of 2020. Items, facilities, supports, and services covered by CRF must be in use before 12/30. Lost revenue is not an allowable expense under CRF. And capital projects are not covered expenses. Applications must agree to implement the health and safety requirements identified by Maine CDC, and this is done through an assurance by your superintendent. Anything you want to add, Tyler?
No, I think, I know Chelsea has some questions rolling in, but we'll see if any of them apply here.
Great, thank you. So the first question, Barb, would a contract that spans more than 1 year be an allowable CRF expense?
The answer to that is no, because we can't have any prepaid expenses, right? So services can only be provided or paid for March 1st through 12/30.
What about an iPad app license that you can only purchase for 1 year, Barb?
So if it were me, given the parameters of contracts that we just spoke about, I think I would be looking to move that off to my ESSER funds.
Okay. Tyler, the next question is for you. Would you please define capital projects?
So I'm looking that up. So it's capital projects are capital outlays including acquisition or construction of capital facilities and other capital assets.
So these are not capital improvements they're speaking of here. Some of you have done ventilation system work. Those are improvements and not projects. So it's not paying to build anything, but it is paying to make improvements to open schools safely.
Right, and so you can, I mean, so typically when we think of capital projects, we're thinking of building brand new spaces versus repairing or renewing old spaces. So renewing or repairing old spaces would not be a capital project versus if you're building new space, that would be a capital project.
The other way around. Building new space, no. Improving, yes.
And with all of this, for audit purposes, you must maintain documentation that supports that this was directly related to COVID-19 and in response to this public health emergency. So that piece there is going to be key in every single purchase you make with CRF funds, and it will impact all of us as we go through the auditing cycles, both at the state level and at the federal level. The next question I have for you, Barb, and Barb, you all should know Barb was a big advocate on this one. Barb, do we have a 10% wiggle room on CRF budgets?
We do. We have the IDEA definition of the 10% rule. So you have 10% of your total award is a wiggle room. There's your 10% rule is 10% of your total award. So we assume that your budgets are your best guess. And we allow you a 10% variance to account for the fact that we don't know exactly what something's necessarily going to cost.
Thank you. I'm going to go through some of my private messages, but not out anyone, I promise. It's going to take me a little more time to ask you the question. We previously were hoping to pay for several licenses through CRF, but they of course do span a year. Is it true that you've recommended that we switch that cost to another funding stream, Barb?
Well, remember you have two different emergency relief funds here. One is to cover 2 years worth of unanticipated COVID-related expenses. So if for like an online platform or an online learning system to do remote learning, that's a longer term expense that is driven by COVID that would be perfectly suitable to the ESSER funds. Whereas because of the length of the obligation, they don't fit within your CRF funds. So you really need to sit down and decide where are your shorter term needs to address opening schools in a safe and healthy way versus what kind of expenses you have that are COVID related for an ongoing period of time, and certainly through the school year FY21.
Okay, thank you. The next one, it's a little feedback, but then followed with a question. Chelsea, thank you for holding this today. I have to tell you, I'm very frustrated because I wish I had known this sooner, but hey, better late than never. Quick question. Who keeps changing the rules? So Barb, I'm not going to send this to you or to Tyler. I'm going to answer this question. And I think this is an important thing for us to just put out there. The rules of this pot of money come directly from the federal government. They are not coming from the Department of Education. The Department of Education's finance leads, Stan and Rui, they have attended conversations and trainings with DAFS as DAFS has received information from the US Treasury. Now, the US Treasury has changed not only their reporting categories, but some of the nuances that are related to coronavirus relief funds as early as late last week. And so I hear you that it's frustrating. We are absolutely beside you in trying to figure out how can we follow the rules, but also not put an unnecessary burden on each of you, because we know how overwhelmed you are with just making sure we safely open school for kids. So I apologize for the stress we've added. I do want you to know, though, we are not making up any of these rules. We are following what we've been given because we want to make sure that we all are successful through the audit process and there are no conversations about having to return funds. So thank you for the feedback. If anything changes between this week and next week's office hours, information we receive from the US Treasury on these funds, we will commit to sending you an email through Tyler's listserv and putting it out through the newsroom so that you don't have any more surprises. But I cannot commit to saying I know that nothing will change, because history has shown us that it's changing every week or so, and I know how frustrating it is, but thank you for sticking with us. The CRF FAQs have been updated to reflect all of the recent information received from the US Treasury, and we will be getting those out of the newsroom later today. A few other questions as we go through this. So with CRF, we had to purchase software for remote learning. The license is for 1 year. Should I move it to ESSER? I'm not going to hand that to anyone. I'm just going to answer it. And the answer is yes. If your license is for more than the time period that is allowable, which ends in December, we will need you to remove it and ask me via email, CHELSEY.A.FORTIN I'll also put it in the chat, to say you do need to make some revisions to your ESSER application.
Also, if you move anything out of your current CRF application, remember that September 30 deadline for reallocating those funds to an allowable project. I do see there was a question on the 10% rule. So that's that's not per project. That's an aggregate across projects, that 10% of your total award. And we are getting questions about outdoor classroom space. And because I'm not as familiar as Stan and you, Chelsea, and Tyler on where CRF funds are coming in on that, so I would think that there would be no additions to the school building, but
so again,
what about
capital improvements? But I want to focus us today. This is not about allowability. This has to be about reimbursement. That's what we promised to deliver. I have the question written down. I do not know the answer. We will ask DAFs, and when we have a response, we will add it to the FAQs, okay? There are 2 more questions I want to make sure I ask before we move forward, and then we can keep going. Another one about the 10%. Does the 10% mean that we could potentially go over our total allocation if the actual cost versus budgeted costs come in higher? Barb?
No, you cannot go over your allocation. What you can do is be short in a category and over in another by 10%. So whatever you budgeted in that line, you're allowed to be 10% over, but that 10% comes from one of your other lines. So there's no going over your allocation.
All right, last question, just so that we stay within the time frame we have here for this section, to Tyler. Tyler, is there a chart of accounts available for us to use for expenses, specifically for student versus staff PPE?
So we haven't created a chart of accounts specific to CRF like we did for the ESER, and so part of that was kind of a decision on how best to spend time. But so when you think about coding for CRF, these expenses, as far as the program function and object code will go, how you code them will be no different than how you do in your general fund. But if you have expenses that are new and different, and so you have a question about how to code those expenses, then you can send me those emails individually, and that's fine. So specific to the PPE for staff versus student, the student is going to be function 2130, which is student health, versus 2575 for staff health.
Thank you, Tyler. I have a few private messages and one public message around the FAQs. The FAQs will change if the information from the US Treasury shifts. So if it changes in any way, we will need to change them, and we will post them in the newsroom, and Tyler will send them to the entire listserv so that everyone gets the information as quickly as possible. Additionally, we will make sure we have office hours for you within the next few days so that you know of the changes. That is precisely why we're here today. Obviously, we needed to go over reimbursement, but there were some changes that came in late last week that we knew we needed to tell you about them. We also meet with your superintendent presidents at the end of each week, and we gave them a heads up that the information had changed, which is why we're meeting today to talk about it. So I understand that it's incredibly frustrating. We will continue to do our very best to get the updated information from the federal government to you as soon as possible. At this point in time, with the changes that have been made, we still are within a window that we can make the correction. I'm with you in that I hope that it ends, but I cannot promise you that they'll stop making changes. Now, Barb, I'm going to hand it back to you. This PowerPoint, as you all know, will be on the CARES Act webpage by 4 o'clock because we know that not everyone was able to join us today. Go ahead, Barb.
Next slide. So we wanted to talk about substantially different use, and this is in the FAQs, but I wanted to point it out here. Redeploying staff to enable compliance with COVID-19 is allowable if that person is working in a different cost objective. So enhanced sanitation, enforcing social distancing measures, education support staff of faculty to develop online learning. What the difference is in the definition of substantially different use is it's important for you to note that providing a function from a different location or in a different manner, so say online instruction versus classroom instruction, does not constitute a substantially different use. So you can't take a teacher and pay them with CRF funds simply because they're now teaching through an online remote class. However, if you have a teacher who is enforcing social distancing measures, to their teaching duties, then that is a CRF allowable cost. Hiring new people for sanitation and janitorial services, hiring people to enforce social distancing, all allowable things. So if you have a teacher who's creating or providing technology support for online learning, that's where you start to get into that shift over to allowability. So I really wanted to point out that just because your educators are now changing to a different remote learning or teaching, Tyler, did you mute me?
So I was trying to let somebody in and somebody else let them in before I clicked it. And so then I muted you. Sorry.
So Chelsea, I don't know if you want to pause for questions or if anybody heard any of that, but
So Barb, I actually thought my computer was crashing, but it seems we were all muted. So I would ask if you could repeat that. I didn't catch any of it.
sure. So we had, I had mentioned we would talk about the definition substantially different use. And it's important to know what that definition means as it's conveyed to us through guidance. So redeploying staff to enable compliance with COVID-19, allowable. So enhanced sanitation, social, staff to enforce social distancing measures, support staff or faculty to develop online learning, that is tech support that is not part of the staff or faculty's ordinary responsibilities. The difference that the line here to qualify or not qualify for substantially different use is you cannot provide providing a function from a different location or in a different manner does not meet the threshold of substantially different use. So online instruction versus classroom instruction is the perfect example. You have a teacher who teaches class who's now going to be remote teaching, still teaching, simply just remote. So that would not meet the threshold of substantially different use, and that teacher would not be an allowable CRF cost. Now, if that person was repurposed to something else like sanitation or enforcing social distancing, then that's where you shift back over to allowability.
Barb, there is one question in the chat, and I believe you're going to cover it in more detail soon. But if a person is hired to either be a substitute teacher for online learning or a health screener, will that be a covered use?
So the health screener, certainly, right? So again, I'm going to defer to people who have been immersed in CRF longer than I have. But to me, the difference here is to open safely, to get the FY21 school rolling safely. So health screening, certainly. Substitute teachers, I mean, that would be an Easter fund cost to me. But again, I'm going to defer to Stan and Chelsea and Tyler for their comments on that one.
Tyler, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think Barb kind of, it's more of a Easter fun cost.
Yeah, it's an additional cost that you've realized because of COVID. It's not necessarily it's not necessarily the urgent need to reopen schools in a safe and healthy way, right? So to me, that is the difference. Again, emergency, urgently needed money to open schools in a safe and healthy way versus extra costs that you have now because of COVID-19. So those two very.
And the CRF team has been working. So the CRF team, again, just to reiterate, Rui, Stan Sawyer, Dan Chuda, those folks have been working with DAFs on updating the FAQ sheet to get some of this clarification. Today, we are really needing to focus on reimbursement. That is what the three of us have prepared to do and are equipped to do well. So I see the questions. JC Holmes is writing them down. We will make sure they make it to DAFs, and you will get answers in the FAQ sheet. But I'm going to have Tyler move to the next slide so that we can keep going on the reimbursement topic.
Grant reimbursement. Yay, here we are. Okay. Everything should be coded to Fund 2606. That is your CRF fund code. Must not be obligated prior to March 1st. Must be liquidated on or before January 29th. So your obligations all need to be made by December 30th. Purchase orders done, supplies ordered, that type of thing, December 30th. And then you have until January 29th to collect all your invoices for those materials and send in your request for reimbursement. So requests for reimbursement that come in after January 29th will not be accepted. So that's a hard deadline. So make sure that you get all of your reimbursement requests in by January 29th. I did see a question earlier in the chat box about sending in invoices. So someone has an August invoice in and would like to send in September. I think that's perfectly fine. So let's talk about invoicing. You have your CRF invoice template. What you need to do when you submit the invoice to Rui is you need to attach a detailed trial balance for Fund 2606. She will be sending, because these are such short-term funds, if we don't see Fund 2606 on there, she will be sending it back and requesting that everything be moved into 2606. So make sure your detailed trial balance reflects all costs in Fund 2606. There's a little affirmation statement, and we're going to go over that in a couple of slides here. Chelsea referred to the fact that we have to provide assurances that these are CRF allowable COVID funds not previously located on your budget. So it's just a little statement that you're going to put on top of all copies of all your paid invoices. So that's nothing new to you. That's the same thing you do with IDA if you get called for compliance. The only difference is you want to provide copies of all of your paid invoices. And then time and effort, if applicable, if you have salaries and benefits in the request. So Tyler, if you want to move on to the next slide.
I need to pause. I have two questions that are pertinent to this conversation. Barb, are we using the GEM reimbursement system that we use for most federal funds?
No, this is, you have an Excel spreadsheet of an invoice template that goes to Rui. This is not being done through the GEM system.
Second question, Tyler, if I have already submitted my reimbursement request and I need to make an amendment, what would you suggest I do?
Well, so if it has already been approved by DAFs, I don't, Barb, is there a way that we've done?
So it hasn't been approved by DAFs because we're working on that right now, processing our first ones. So I would contact Rui and ask her to kindly reject the invoice and send it back to you.
No. So if they submitted it through ESSER funds.
Oh, nope.
Oh, okay.
Barb has us on the right track.
Okay.
So the question, if I've already submitted it and I need to make an amendment, I email Rui immediately, tell her to pull it back, and I will resubmit.
Okay.
Okay. The question around substitute teachers has come up again. Number 41 on the FAQ sheet does address additional staff needs for the many different reasons you may need to safely reopen. That answer is in the chat. But again, the three people you have today are not allowability experts, but the FAQ sheet addresses this in detail. If you have specific questions around what is in your approved application, the only individual that can talk to you about that is Stan Sawyer, because he is the one reviewing and approving them. I'm not putting you off. I'm just making sure that we get you to the right person. So I see two comments in there about submitted applications already. We will make sure that Stan gets those and responds to you today.
Okay, so I just wanted to quickly go over what a date of obligation means. And the best way to do that is through examples. So you have March 1st as your agreement start date. You cannot obligate funds prior to March 1st. You cannot make an obligation prior to receiving an award. So I gave 4 examples here. The first one being payroll for days worked in February, but are included in a payroll run on March 3rd. Not allowable because the date of obligation happens when the work is performed. The second one is a purchase order for supplies was created February 28th and supplies were received March 15th. Again, not allowable because the obligation was made when the PO was created. A contract is executed February 28th for services to be performed in June. Not allowable because the obligation is made when you sign that contract. And awarded funds can never be obligated or committed prior to the agreement start date unless it's explicitly stated in the award that pre-award costs are allowable. And in this case, it's not March 1st agreement start date. So no obligations prior to March 1st. You want to make sure you look at all of your paid invoices that you're sending in for reimbursement and make sure that everything is March 1st or after. So no purchase orders, no order dates prior to March 1st. Next slide. And then on the other side, the liquidation of funds. So funds invoiced, all of your reimbursement invoices need to be submitted to DRUI at DOE for reimbursement by January 29th at 4 p.m. So all services must have been rendered, supplies and equipment ordered by 12/30. So that's your obligation and the last day you can obligate the funds. But you wouldn't want to order anything that you didn't have an invoice for. So it hadn't been delivered, supplies hadn't arrived, you don't have an invoice for. Unless you can get that invoice to us, and look at that, I got 129 and 130. So there's some conflicting information. You can strike that 130, it's 129.
So, and we'll fix these before we post them. And we also have the wrong year in there. There should be 21, not 20.
Oh, because we're in January, see? Yep. That's what you call a 10 p.m., slide. So anyway, my mistakes, so sorry. Anyway, so you don't want to order anything that you're not going to get for, 2-3 months because you won't have an invoice for it, right? You have to have all invoices in your possession in order to attach it to the reimbursement request to send to RUI by 1/29/21. So bear that in mind. And also, this is also a hard deadline, so we cannot extend this deadline. So please be mindful of your liquidation period. And again, if it looks like you're not going to be able to get invoices in to submit by 1/29, we might want to think about making sure that we do purchase things that you won't run into any issues on the reimbursement side for.
So this question, I'm going to open it up to either Tyler or Barb. We now have expenses spanning 2 different fiscal years. Most were paid from regular operating funds and now need to be moved to Fund 2606 via journal entry. So expenses incurred in March will show on the trial balance as the journal entry date. Is that going to be an issue?
So your posting is, well, that's a good question. So your billing period still should be December because January is simply liquidation. You're waiting for the invoice to come in, but it hasn't been paid. Yes, that is allowable. Sorry, I had to work my way through that. But yes, it's the same as it is for IDA funds or title funds or any liquidation period for federal funds.
Tyler, the next question is for you. In March through June, I did not have the 2606 fund created. Now, obviously, to their benefit. That's because it didn't exist for anyone. But how do I now handle that? And what do I do with those invoices? Because of course, this is going to show up in the trial balance.
I'm actually gonna see if Joanne has a suggestion on that one. If she's happens to be, I see she's on. I don't know if she's
I'm listening, but I don't want to answer this off the cuff. So I think that we should probably have a conversation about it, Barb and Tyler and myself and anyone else, so that we get the right answer.
Yep.
So we'll put that one on the FAQ sheet when we send that out later today. The next question. So we need to create Fund 2606 in our system with all associated expenses and earning codes.
Yes, unfortunately, because it's the only audit trail we're going to have, and they need to be isolated.
There's a private message to me, and the essence of the question is, how do I prove that something was not budgeted for?
So this is where the little affirmation statement that we're going to go over comes in. It's very hard to do. I mean, logically, you're ordering PPE. It probably isn't part of your last year's budget, but there will be some additional supplies and equipment. For instance, a new floor cleaner or something like that, right? It's in addition to, because you've got to do 15 times the cleaning that you had to do last year. So, I mean, a lot of these expenses are going to be logically COVID related, or you could make that connection. It's when you run into things like general supplies, and your invoices will have to detail what you've purchased. They always do. But general supplies, you could start to say, you know, what does paper have to do with safely opening? So you just want to stay within like a logical track of expenditures, right? But you're not going to be able to prove that you didn't budget for that last year. We just want to be able to logically make the assumption and then provide an affirmation statement, which is you saying it was not budgeted for.
I have another one that I think supports that question, and it's someone just kind of checking their understanding. So I'd like to share it with you both. So in our case, we've never provided remote learning. Due to COVID-19, we are now providing both in-person and remote instruction. I feel that that is a clear unbudgeted item. Should I add any additional information on my invoices to confirm this?
So again, the little affirmation statement is just saying it was not budgeted before. I think that's a logical conclusion that any remote learning software platforms, technology would not have been something pre-COVID. So you can see where logically you can associate remote learning with COVID. But I will say that your educators' salaries and benefits would not be allowable because it's just a different way of teaching. So it's not a substantial difference. And to provide software licenses, CRF funds can only provide that from March 1st to December 30th. And then you would have to move that off into your ESSER funds.
And Barb, you've said something that I think there'll be some private messages to me soon, so I want to dig a little deeper into that. Your regular staff that you always had, that you did budget for, no, of course they wouldn't be eligible, but you have likely had to hire health screeners, additional folks to make sure that it is a safe reopen for kids, and they may be in different roles across the school. That is something that you will discuss with Stan Sawyer, the person that reviews these and approves them, directly. And he may need to ask you some more details. And what he's getting at, he's helping you provide the paper trail and documentation to show that yes, in fact, this is related to COVID-19 to make sure our kids can safely come back to school. And no, we didn't budget for it because we're living in a time that we could never have imagined for. And that is why we need these people. So just know that when those questions are being asked, he's helping you build that paper trail so that when you put that affirmation statement on these invoices and send them to Rui, we have a clear, several pieces of documentation to show that this is an allowable expense. I know that it can, of course, be very frustrating, but know that that's the process we're going through, and we're trying to help each other out in that way. I have a few more questions, but I know we're at 2 minutes left, so I'm going to save them and let you guys keep going.
Okay, moving on. Next slide. Okay, so prior to submitting an invoice, please review and confirm the following: that expenses are linked to a project in the application, they're allowable, they're unbudgeted for, and are not reimbursed by any other source. Expenses in the category, they are in the category for which they apply. Billing period reflects when the expenses were paid. The amount does not exceed the balance of the grant. Compliance documentation is attached, again, detailed trial balance and copies of all invoices with the affirmation statement, and includes the appropriate funding codes, funding code 2606. Next slide, 1 minute. Okay, this is where you want to submit your electronic invoices. We did please want to ask you, because this is not the GEM system, to put your name, your district name, within the electronic file. So CRF budget dash invoice, no, but Pine RSU CRF invoice, yes. And I would identify this as invoice 1, 2, 3, or 4. And this is simply for filing purposes, so Rui can pull your information up quickly if she needs to. So again, CRF March to June, no, but add your district name. We are seeing a lot of invoices without the billing period on here, and I just wanted to point out that that peach color, that is your billing period. You need to put your to and from dates in there, and they should match your detailed trial balance. Next slide. We're seeing a lot of, you just want to make sure that your categories and where you're putting your invoicing in is accurate and matches up with the application. So this is just an example. Category G is technology related costs. This district had some supplies, 10,000, but they had 45,000 in equipment. And we received a $6,400 invoice reimbursement request. Just make sure that that wasn't included in the equipment line in the application, because you don't want to draw down the wrong line too quickly, even with your 10% rule. Compliance documentation, we want to see all purchase orders, copies of all paid invoices, similar to what you see through other federal programs. All invoices should be dated and clearly identify what was purchased. So credit card statements, not allowable. It just has a date and who you paid. That's not an invoice. We need the invoice. Same thing with ACH purchases. Those alone don't provide the level of detail that's needed for compliance. And then provide an affirmation of allowability cover sheet, which I hope is next, Tyler. Okay, adequately documented. We're going to let you go ahead and read through this. So in addition to superintendents and heads of schools, business managers are required to attest to the CRF requirements have been met. And that's that little affirmation statement, hopefully is next. There it is. It's a simple little statement, just a little piece of paper on top of your paid invoices that tells us who you are, what invoice number you're submitting, and just this little, to the best of your knowledge, expenses included in the reimbursement are for allowable CRF expenses associated with COVID and not previously budgeted for. You just date and sign it. And again, it's to the best of your knowledge. So this is a cover sheet that should go on top of all paid invoices that you submit for reimbursement. So reconciliation, your CRF invoice total should reconcile with your detailed trial balance for Fund 2606. And that should also total all paid invoices if you 10 key them and add them all up. All of the above should reconcile with actual expenditure financial data for Fund 2606 in NEO at the end of Q2. I'm going to put some time and effort documents up, examples, Chelsea, because we don't have time if we're done at 11. I did want to do a couple of things here. Vendor codes has come up with RUI. And if you open your IDA or titles GEM invoices, you'll see your vendor code right on there. But if not, you can contact Stacy Bean on my team. It's stacey.bean@maine.gov. And we'll toss it in the chat. And she'll look that up for you. That vendor code has to be included in every single invoice reimbursement request that you send in. I also did want to just throw a few things out there about time and effort. So we want to make sure that you have a policy on emergency measures as far as paying employees above and beyond their regular contract or regular hours. So if you have a teacher who's under contract and you want to pay them to do some after-school learning on ESSER funds or to enforce social distancing measures on the school bus or something above and beyond that you want to pay them for, that you really should have a policy in your policies and procedures manual. And the last question, Tyler, you had asked me a lot of questions around procurement, and if somebody gets 3 quotes but only 1 responds back, you should have in your policies and procedures emergency purchasing measures. So if you don't have time to go through the whole process of a sealed bid or whatnot, you could deploy your emergency policy as far as procurement goes, but you have to have one. So I would look at that. I would look at your policies and procedures. And I would also make sure that I do a very close review of your conflict of interest policy. And we can talk more about that in some other time, but we're 5 minutes over, Chelsea.
So there are a few questions that I want to handle before we conclude. I know that we're past 11 and I understand if folks have to leave, but there are some that are pretty urgent. So no POs here. Many supplies were ordered through Amazon via our credit card. I do have those detailed Amazon invoices. Is that going to be okay?
Yes, detailed Amazon invoices is perfectly fine, but not just the Amazon account or MasterCard that you use to pay for it.
Okay, no POs here. Will that be a problem?
No, we want to see the date ordered. Amazon does indicate the date that you place the order.
Is it true that PARs can't be signed by supervisors?
That is true. PARs need to be signed by employees, and we do encourage for CRF funds, because they are short-term, that you use the PAR. So when you send a reimbursement request into RUI, you really should be submitting time and effort for what you've invoiced for. So PARs can be at least monthly. So if you have a payroll run or 2 payroll runs that you're asking for reimbursement, go ahead and do a PAR for that. And then she'll have the time and effort documented. And again, that's just to ensure that we're maintaining that paper trail for you.
The detailed trial balance is where there's going to be an issue with expenses incurred last year, but being submitted now to the CRF fund to reimbursement. Dates of service, date of trial balance, they won't match.
Yeah, this is true, because it's all sitting off in your general fund probably, or even somewhere else. So what you're going to have to do, is provide us with, again, I think Joanne wanted to talk about this internally, but it could be that you're going to have to do your journal entries, moving that over to 2606. And we'll just want to see the detail in the journal entries, but we will let you know that's going in our FAQs.
That is what I was going to suggest, Barb, is that we are going to have to see the journal entries, because otherwise we will never see the dates.
Yeah, and again, if we get audited, they'll pull some of your files, and we just want to be able to provide that paper trail rather than have it go any further than DOE. So
Correct.
we want to make sure we have everything for you in the event you're chosen for an audit.
And a journal entry is always a red flag for an auditor, so they will tend to look at those pretty closely.
Will my expense codes need to be by school, or can they be 95 or 99 locations?
So though we always prefer by school codes, because there's quite a bit of other work that's being added to these funds, we are allowing it the 950 and 990.
Oh, Stacy's info. Let me put that in the chat box.
We have 100 teachers working on remote curriculum that will be a boatload of parts, like herding cats, some might say.
So what I would do is maybe modify your timesheet, add the affirmation statement and the other information that's necessary, and have them sign. They sign their timesheet anyway, chances are. So that is what I would do. I do have a modified COVID stipend time and effort that I will share with you, but it's going to take some time to go over it. Chelsea, we did that with the ESSER funds.
Yeah, so I have a couple other, an email and a private message, and it's thank you very much, Tyler, Barb, Joanne, Chelsea, for doing this today. I'm feeling a little frazzled still, and I'd like more time with you, specifically about allowable costs. So to that one, thank you for sending the message. We're glad that this was helpful, but we understand that you have more questions. For those of you that have asked allowability questions, I have them. They will go to Stan. I can also check in with the CRF team about their time available for the remaining of the week. We do not have the answer to your questions. Otherwise, we would answer them, right? So the CRF team, they'll be able to address those questions, and we'll reach out if they have some availability this week with some times that are offered. But the folks that are here, Tyler and Barb, were asked to do this presentation because they are our finance experts of the department. And so I feel badly trying to put them out of their depth by asking questions that I know they can't answer. And that's why I'm not highlighting those other allowability questions. Those are really specific to Stan Sawyer, as he has already reviewed and approved many of your applications, and he can speak to those conversations he may have had with you or a member of your team, and likely your superintendent. There are a few, though, about finance-related items that I'd still like to go over. When you see a journal entry, do you mean a printout of the individual entry? For example, a journal register.
Let's start with the register. I think we're going to need a little bit of detail on those journal entries. But that being said, they should match up with copies of paid invoices that you're seeking reimbursement for. So let's start with the register. And if we need more detail, we can certainly get back to you on that.
Okay, on the next one, we have a swipe card system. Can we print those and have the staff members sign those?
So the PARs, which we didn't have time to go over today, contain an affirmation statement. So they have to let you know in what percentage they worked in CRF funds, what percentage they got paid in local funds, if they worked in just one cost objective or over multiple cost objectives. So there's a bit more information that you need to put in there, but they can be modified, or again, you can use the COVID time and effort that was approved through our TA provider with the feds. And I can share that with you, but I hate to do that without going over it first because I wouldn't want to have them returned.
Another question that's come through, and I'll answer this one. I'm starting to wonder who's in charge of what program. Is there a place where I can find that information? Of course, I know that you and Barb are related to ESER in some way, but I've heard other people on the call. Where are those roles and responsibilities? All of that is on the CRF webpage. So earlier in the session, I put in the CARES Act link. You want to go there directly. So if you're wondering, you know, like I'm asking a question and I feel like it's not getting answered, but they're deferring to someone else. We're deferring to someone else because that person is in charge of making all program decisions. So I know you're very used to having Barb and Tyler and I answer program questions when it comes to ESER. That's because I was assigned to program leadership for ESER, but I don't have the capacity for CRF. That is Stan Sawyer. Adult education, if you ask Stan Sawyer about adult education, he would tell you you need to speak with the adult education director. That is Gail Sinise. If you're wondering about day programming, that program director is Leanne Larson. And you'll notice the reason why they're divided up, we wanted to make sure the folks with the program expertise are answering your questions and have a deep understanding of what the implications would be and can think about allowability at that level with you. What is the expected approval time span after submitting a CRF invoice? So Tara, that's a good question. And I think it's coming from the fact that with ESER, we've had that turnaround and we were clear from the beginning. Now, Tyler, you've been doing ESER. And that's been very quickly happening so far.
So there was a little delay early on, but we're quicker now.
So how fast are we moving with ESER right now?
So now I'm getting them done by the end of the week.
Okay. And Rui, how fast do you suspect you'll be able to operate? And if you don't know the answer because you've just started this week, that's okay too. We can follow up next week with the answer.
I can give you a better answer next week. What I am finding is I'm just starting to get a lot of invoices. Some came in as early as the 20th, but really it was just 2 days ago that I started going through the ones that I have. And I've asked Barbara a lot of questions, and some people I'm going to start reaching back out to because of some changes that need to be made. So my goal would be to match Tyler in his turnaround time, but I'm not sure that that will happen in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, the next question is, where do I find the sheet? So the CRF template for invoicing is on the CARES Act webpage. We'll put that link again in the chat for you. The question, the next one, I think this is yours, Tyler. The CRF spreadsheet keeps a running total, but is unlike the GEM system. Does one have to save after each CRF invoice number?
So I would save a separate version of it after you submit each invoice, yes.
And then the last one, it's not a question that's going to the three of you. It's more of a request, which I believe we can meet. And the request is, on the FAQ document, can we get a copy of an approved invoice? So I think that shouldn't be an issue at all. We can draw, basically remove all of the RSU information and put that on our CARES Act webpage. I would suspect, given the information just shared by Rui and Barb, we would not have that by the end of the day today, but we would have it by the end of the week. Last question, because I know it's 11:15. Does each timesheet need a number, Barb?
It should have dates. It should have the dates worked on it. So I'm not sure what you mean by a number. You mean an identifier? Because when we're interested in your billing period, then
Yes.
identifier, yes. So we simply look at the dates, the payroll dates.
I want to thank everyone for sticking with us. I know we went well over time. We do want to respect your time. We will follow up with the slide deck, and we will also look to see if there's any availability for Stan Sawyer to follow up on some of those questions around allowability. He does have the questions that you've put in the chat. If you have other questions, we'll keep this open for a few more minutes so that you can place them here. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. Just as a a sales pitch. We hope you can join us again. It will be focused solely on reporting. So that October 2 initial report, we will discuss that in detail. And if we do not have answers for you at that time, we'll make sure that we get them. Again, if anything changes from the federal government between now and next week, we will make sure we get that to you both through email, the newsroom, and likely another webinar.
Chelsea, this is Stan. It would be helpful to me if people had additional questions. They just emailed them to me. Everyone has my email address. Some even have my personal home email address. But I would encourage you to use my maine.gov, stanley.j.sawyer@maine.gov, and I'll be sure to respond. That works so much better for me, just emailing me your questions.
All right, so Stan, I'm going to put that in the chat and folks can email you directly. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
So thanks everyone. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point in time, but you can still continue to put questions in the chat. I'll leave it open for a few more minutes.